The electric chair was too big for his small body. At 14 years old and weighing barely 90 pounds, George Stinney Jr. needed a phone book to reach the electrodes properly when South Carolina strapped him into Old Sparky on June 16, 1944. He became the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century, and 70 years later, a judge would overturn his conviction, declaring that this black child had been railroaded by a system designed to destroy him. The boy who carried his Bible to his execution was innocent of the murders that cost him his life. Alcolu, South Carolina, in 1944, was a sawmill town where segregation wasn't just law, it was religion. White families lived on one side of the railroad tracks while black families existed in a separate world of poverty and fear on the other side. The Stinney family occupied the bottom rung of this rigid hierarchy, sharecroppers who worked white-owned land for barely enough to survive. George Stinney Jr. was the third of 10 children born to George Sr. and Amy Stinney. Young George was small for his age, quiet and respectful in the way that black children learned to be around white adults if they wanted to avoid trouble. He attended the segregated school for black children when farm work didn't require his help, and he spent his free time fishing in local creeks and playing with his younger siblings. Neighbors described him as a gentle boy who helped his mother with household chores and never caused problems for anyone. Betty June Binneker, 11, and Mary Emma Thames, 8, were picking mayhaw flowers near the railroad tracks on March 23, 1944, when they encountered George Stinney and his younger sister Catherine. The white girls were searching for flowers to make syrup, a common springtime activity for children in rural South Carolina. According to Catherine Stinney's later testimony, the girls approached them and asked where they might find more flowers. George politely told them he didn't know and continued on his way home with his sister. This brief, innocent encounter would become the foundation for his death sentence. The next morning, search parties discovered the bodies of Betty June and Mary Emma in a water-filled ditch near the sawmill. Both girls had suffered massive skull fractures from repeated blows with a heavy object, later determined to be a railroad spike. The brutal murders shocked the small community and immediately focused attention on finding the killer. In 1944, South Carolina, when white children were murdered, suspicion automatically fell on the nearest black males, regardless of evidence or logic. Sheriff H.S. Newman arrested George Stinney Jr. within hours of discovering the bodies, despite having no physical evidence linking the boy to the murders. The arrest was based solely on the fact that he had been seen talking to the victims the day before they died. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no forensic evidence, just the word of white townspeople who assumed the black boy must be guilty. George was taken from his home and held in the county jail 50 miles away, isolated from his family and any potential legal representation. The interrogation of 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. violated every principle of juvenile justice and due process. He was questioned for hours without an attorney, without his parents present, and without any recording of what was actually said. Deputies claimed he confessed to the murders, describing how he had killed both girls with a railroad spike during an attempted sexual assault. George's supposed confession made no logical sense when examined carefully. According to deputies, he claimed to have killed Betty June first, then chased down Mary Emma and murdered her as well. However, the crime scene evidence suggested both girls were killed in the same location, not that one was chased down after witnessing the other's murder. Additionally, the alleged motive of sexual assault was never supported by medical evidence, as the victims' bodies showed no signs of sexual violence. The prosecution's case consisted entirely of the alleged confession, which was presented through the testimony of the arresting officers. No physical evidence was introduced linking George to the murders. No witnesses placed him at the crime scene. The prosecution could not even establish that he had the physical strength to inflict the severe injuries found on the victims. The railroad spike allegedly used as the murder weapon was never found, despite extensive searches of the area. Yet this absence of evidence was treated as proof of guilt rather than reasonable doubt. The all-white jury deliberated for less than 10 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty. Judge P.H. Stoll immediately sentenced George Stinney Jr. to death in the electric chair, making him the youngest person condemned to execution in modern American history. The Stinney family was forced to flee Alcolu immediately after George's arrest, when white townspeople threatened violence against them. They lost their home, their possessions, and their livelihood simply because their son had been accused of murder. On June 16, 1944, exactly 81 days after his arrest, George Stinney Jr. was led into the death chamber at the South Carolina State Penitentiary. He carried his Bible and walked calmly to the electric chair, showing remarkable composure for a 14-year-old child about to die. The execution was conducted with the same clinical efficiency used for adult prisoners, with no consideration given to the fact that they were about to electrocute a child. When 2,400 volts surged through his body, the oversized mask slipped completely off his face, allowing witnesses to see his final expressions of pain and terror. The boy died at 7:30 p.m., becoming the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. No one claimed George Stinney's body after his execution. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, forgotten by a system that had rushed him from arrest to execution in less than 3 months. His family, still in hiding and living in poverty, lacked the resources to retrieve his body or provide a proper burial. The case was considered closed, another example of swift Southern justice that had protected white children by executing their black murderer. The truth would remain buried for 70 years. In 2004, George Stinney's youngest sister, Catherine, who had been with him when he encountered the murder victims, began speaking publicly about his innocence. She revealed that the family had always known George was innocent, but had been too terrified to speak out in 1944. Her testimony provided crucial evidence that the alleged confession was false, and that George had been home with his family when the murders occurred. Other family members corroborated her account, describing how they had been threatened into silence by white authorities. Local historian George Frierson began investigating the case in 2009, uncovering massive irregularities in the original investigation and trial. His research revealed that deputies had failed to interview potential witnesses, ignored alternative suspects, and rushed to judgment based solely on racial prejudice. Crime scene photographs that had never been presented to the original jury showed evidence that contradicted the prosecution's theory of the murders. The railroad spike allegedly used as the murder weapon would have been too heavy for a 90-pound boy to wield effectively. In 2013, attorneys filed a motion seeking to vacate George Stinney's conviction based on newly discovered evidence and constitutional violations. The motion argued that he had been denied due process, effective counsel, and equal protection under the law. Evidence presented included testimony from surviving family members, crime scene analysis by forensic experts, and documentation of the systematic violations of his rights that had occurred during his arrest, trial, and execution. On December 17, 2014, Circuit Court Judge Carmen Mullen vacated George Stinney Jr.'s conviction, ruling that he had been denied due process and that his execution was a grave miscarriage of justice. The ruling came 70 years too late to save his life, but provided vindication for a child who had been failed by every institution that should have protected him. Modern forensic analysis of the crime scene evidence suggests that the real killer was likely an adult, with significantly more physical strength than 14-year-old George possessed. The positioning of the bodies and the severity of the injuries indicated that the murderer was someone familiar with the area, who had the capability to overpower 2 children simultaneously. Several potential suspects were known to authorities in 1944, but were never seriously investigated because police had already decided George was guilty. The George Stinney Jr. case has become a symbol of the racist injustices that characterized the American legal system during the Jim Crow era. His execution demonstrated how prejudice and fear could corrupt every aspect of the justice system, from initial investigation through final punishment. Modern studies of wrongful convictions have identified many of the same factors that led to George's execution: racial bias, inadequate legal representation, coerced confessions, and rush to judgment by authorities under public pressure. Thank you for watching.